Hi everyone, welcome back to the Atheist Viewpoint. I'm Ellen Johnson, the president of American Atheists, and you know my co-host Dennis Horvitz. And back with us this week, we're so happy, is Dr. Massimo Pigliucci, author of, among other books, Denying Evolution. We've talked about this in previous programs.
And not the original bass player for Motley Crue.
No.
I just had to make that up.
How many Massimo Pigliuccis do you know? He's a professor of ecology and evolution at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and he holds 3 doctoral degrees, 1 in genetics, 1 in botany, and 1 in philosophy. And he has received the Dobzhansky Prize from the Society for the Study of Evolution, and he is a 3-time winner of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Science Alliance Faculty Research Award. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of the Paranormal. He has debated all of the creationists, Duane Gish, at least 5 times. He has written, besides Denying Evolution, he's the author of Phenotypic Integration, Making Sense of Evolution, and Tales of the Rational. And he has a blog. We'll give you information at the end of the program on how to access the blog. And he's also interested in experimenting with new methods of teaching, both graduate and undergraduate classes, and we'll talk about that later. But we were just, during the break, we were talking about the subject of free will came up, and that's something that people either don't understand what it is, or they just assume, well, of course we have free will. I have the free will to decide to go to the mall or the movies, so why don't we have free will, Dr. Pigliucci, and what is it that we're talking about?
The situation is worse than we don't have free will, is that several philosophers make the point that the very concept of free will actually doesn't make sense, and therefore it doesn't make sense to ask whether we have it or not. So as you said, the most common misconception is the equation between free will and decision making. Yes, of course we make decisions. There's nobody doubts that. And those decisions are informed by a variety of different factors. We make decisions that are affected by our upbringing, they're affected by our experiences, they're affected by what we read, who we talk to. They're also affected in some sense indirectly, certainly by our genetic constitution, for example. We might have certain propensities that depend on our genes and the way in which the genes interact with our environment. So in that sense, nobody's denying that human beings have a decision-making capability. But frankly, so do computers, once that they're programmed correctly. So decision-making by itself doesn't buy you free will. It buys you decision-making. Now, in the case of free will, the philosophers have discussed this for a long time, but I find the best way to think about free will is as an example of what philosophers call a category mistake. A category mistake is something like the following. Suppose that you go to my campus, the campus where I work, Stony Brook University, and I'll show you around campus, and I show you I introduce you to some of the faculty, to some of the students, I show you the buildings, I show you the administration, I show you the fountain, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the day, you say, yeah, but where is the university? If you ask me that question, you're committing a category mistake. You're assuming that the university is something above and beyond what I just showed you, while in fact the university is what I showed you. There is nothing above and beyond it. And similarly, with free will, one can make the argument that free will is simply the psychological feeling that we have when we make decisions. And there's nothing above and beyond that. And to ask if there is anything above and beyond that is missing the point. It's construing something that is not there. Unfortunately, category mistakes are often committed by people who engage in, say, mystical thinking of some sort. And free will gets pretty close to mystical thinking. And category mistakes sort of questions do sound profound. So if I ask you, for example, what is the color of triangles? That sort of question might sort of put you off for a second and say, wow, this is either very stupid or very deep. In fact, it's very stupid because colors do not apply to triangles. I mean, individual triangles, of course, can be one color or another.
Certainly very 60s.
Yeah.
Very 60s question. Yeah.
But colors...
Because I asked that question all through.
You did, and I'm sure you come up with an answer, too.
You don't want to hear it.
Is that what an acid trip is like?
No, probably.
Yeah.
That's what I'm guessing. The idea is that colors as a category simply do not apply to triangles. And so if you put them together, you're creating a spurious category. You're creating something that is not there. And therefore, whatever answer you're going to give, it's simply nonsensical. I really do think that free will, and to some extent consciousness, which is concept very closely related to free will. We are conscious of the decision-making process. And Daniel Dennett, who is very, very smart philosopher who has written about all sorts of things, including free will and consciousness, has suggested, in fact, that consciousness may be the sort of thing that we refer to as category mistake. That is, what there is the activity of the brain, the ability of the brain to react in certain ways to certain circumstances, and the psychological feeling that we have, perception that we have, part of the processes that go inside our own brains. That's what gives consciousness. But to ask, well, here's the brain, and where's the consciousness? It's again asking for, committing a category mistake. So I think that free will falls into that general idea, which means that really we shouldn't be wasting too much time about thinking about free will. We should actually ask ourselves, where do our decisions come from? What kind of factors influence our decisions? Why do we make a decision one way or another? That's a much more sensible question for which we can come up with answers.
But the believer needs to have this idea that there is free will, so we can get blamed
for evil, of course.
Well, it's a hand wave, really. I mean, it's an all-purpose excuse not to confront the inconsistencies about any particular religious doctrine, or about
Right.
a moral, what is considered moral as opposed to immoral, and things like that.
Well, one of the things you will notice if you talk to most believers is that whenever they invoke the so-called free will defense for evil, that is, they blame free will for the existence of evil, then you ask them, if you go one step beyond that and say, well, what is the connection there? Why is it that free will entails evil? They have no answer. And one of the reasons they have no answer, of course, is because they don't really have a particularly good idea what free will is to begin with.
Right.
And it cannot be an answer, because if free will, in fact, is, as I'm suggesting, a category mistake, you cannot use a category mistake as an answer to a real question, which is, why is there evil in the world? There are really good answers to why is it that people commit certain atrocities. But those answers come from cognitive science and from evolutionary biology, not from religion.
Actually, something you mentioned in the last show regarding, you characterized as evil, that had nothing to do with human beings, like such as the people dying in a tsunami or that kind of thing.
Right.
I mean, you really can't even call that kind of thing, evil. It's maybe painful and tragic.
Right.
But when I think of evil, I think of some deliberate malevolence. And certainly,
But I could call them, as an atheist, I could call those occurrences evil, in the sense that if one assumes that in fact there was a supernatural creator
True.
who was perfect and good and
True.
all-knowing,
True.
then how is it that he's responsible? I mean, part of the problem
Right.
with the design argument, which of course the intelligent design argument, which believers one kind or another do have to rely on, one of those problems was pointed out by David Hume, the skeptic philosopher back in the 18th century. And Hume said, okay, well, first of all, he actually was the first one to really articulate an excellent philosophical argument against intelligent design. It's still, to this day, it's the best rebuttal of intelligent design outside of science that I know of. But then Hume said, okay, for the sake of argument, let's assume that in fact there is an intelligent designer. Then you really have to take that possibility seriously and ask yourself, what can I learn about the designer from the things that he has designed? And the picture, it's not pretty.
Yeah.
Because there's all sorts of things that happen in the world that could have been avoided by putting a little more thought into the process.
Well, I think with most believers under those circumstances, there's just a certain disconnect. They just stop.
In some sense,
thinking
they
about
want they want their metaphysical cake and they want to eat it too.
I mean, there were Jews that believed that the Holocaust happened because they didn't live up to follow the Torah, for instance, and there are people who think that people died in the tsunami because they must have been doing some kind of evil,
And I think a good way to think about those instances is to take them at face value, take that reasoning at face value, and see what I have the courage to see what the consequence of that kind of thinking is. All right, so if it is true that a lot of innocent people died in a tsunami, in order for God to punish, maybe one person who was homosexual. Besides the fact that it's very arguable
Right.
that homosexuality is in fact a sin, but even assuming that is a disastrous way of punishing somebody.
It is
and it is in
psychotic.
fact exactly it's psychotic, and it's therefore God would be morally culpable for that sort of thing.
Well, they use
We will
that.
put him on trial
Yeah,
if he were.
they use that
human being.
excuse for